Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing my 14.14 ADC tier list. So if you enjoy the content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. We saw two direct changes to both Smolder and Aphelios. Both of them were buffs. They were underperforming to a degree. Aphelios just across the board. Smolder tends to be a bit more low elo skewed, but needed a bit of help, so they have given him a slight damage increase on the Q. Alongside this, we saw some indirect changes towards some champions. We saw Brand receive a nerf. He's overperforming across multiple roles. We saw Tristana get dragged down a bit. Obviously, mid lane Tristana was the highest prio mid laner in competitive. They wanted to tag that down a bit. She was working too well with some of the systems, absorb life, obviously working really well with AP junglers, and as a knock-on effect, that has hurt ADC Tristana quite a bit. We also saw a nerf towards Corki, who was already underperforming pretty heavily in the ADC role. Taking away 30 health from his early game is going to make him even more punishable, which once again does also take away from his ADC power. This is the changes this patch, so let's get into it. To begin with, the D tier is going to consist of 3 champions. We have Corki, who obviously, as I've said, is underperforming in this role. He does scale slightly with elo, like the higher elo you go, the more effectively this pick seems to perform, but not to a great extent. He still underperforms to a degree in Masters Plus, but as my tier lists are targeted towards the average tier, mid and low elo, yeah, this pick underperforms quite heavily. Moving on from Corki, we have Tristana, who also got nerfed this patch. She did lose a decent amount of power in the ADC role. The mana increase combined with the Q attack speed going down a bit hurts her ability to trade, hurts her ability to stay in lane as much. Obviously, she's quite short range early onto the game. She was kind of bound a bit to her level scaling in the mid lane. Obviously, getting more range every time she levels up is a very powerful tool. She now underperforms in the bot lane, something I'd recommend avoiding for the moment, alongside the fact that marksman items are being nerfed in 14.15. She's definitely going to feel that quite a bit. The other champion here is Varus. He is going to be buffed in 14.15. He does underperform for the average player though at the moment. He still does see a level of competitive play. That obviously is a very different environment to solo queue. In solo queue, he's just not really finding the level of success he really needs. It looks like Kraken Slayer has been his best build ever since they did the changes. That is definitely something to look into, and you should be able to get a bit more better results out of this pick if you alter your build to that degree. Moving on to the C tier, we have a couple of champions here. So we have Callista, who I've moved up from the D tier to the C tier. She's benefited from other champions just being slightly weaker. She's still in a pretty bad spot for the average player, something I'd really recommend avoiding unless you really put the games into this pick. She's quite hard to pilot, but her ability to kite and her early game power can definitely enable situations where you can really carry games. Other picks here, we have Senna, who's really lost a decent amount of popularity in the ADC role at this point. I know Reptile has some sort of Bork variant of Senna, which he seems to be finding a level of success on, but overall this pick just doesn't really have a huge amount of power at the moment. It definitely lost a lot when it got nerfed a couple of times at the beginning of last split, I believe, and then got continuously nerfed by some of the range modifiers being added onto some of the lethality items. She was using those, so it does definitely tag her a bit. Other champions here, so we have Yasuo, who is getting buffed in 14.15, but for the moment is still underperforming. Obviously, his best role was for a while the ADC role. It now looks to be fairly neutral across the board. Obviously, he can be really benefiting from certain synergies. Yumi Yasuo, and then some of the melee supports can definitely work quite nicely with him. He's better utilized as a counter pick option, but he's still a solid C tier pick. The final pick here, well, final 2 picks here actually, we've got Xayah, who's going to be moved down from the B tier to the C tier. I over-moved Xayah. I believed the E-buffs were going to do it a bit more for this champion, but they just haven't really landed as well as I hoped they would. The pick is still very situational, very reliant on getting a lot of value out of her ultimate, being able to have people chase you so you can get your feather value, and just being able to play on certain synergies. Obviously, she can benefit from the likes of Rakan. She's a bit better, but still going to sit towards the top end of the C tier. Not quite as good as I hoped she would ended up. And then the champion who was buffed was Aphelios, and he is going to be sat towards the high end of the C tier as well. Definitely viable for the average player. Again, he was obviously underperforming. They nerfed both IE and Collector. Both these were like his core items. They are nerfing more of those items, but that would just generalistically hit the ADC role in total. Aphelios definitely in a spot where you can play him, and if you put the games in, you can really be rewarded. He's pretty hard to pilot pick, and definitely scales up quite nicely with the elo you're in and the games you put in on the champion. Moving on to the C tier, so we're going to lead off this, moving on to the B tier, we're going to lead off with Hui. Hui is still in a great spot in the bot lane, definitely has been viable for a while. I've seen a couple more people kind of like notice this and like begin to realize and pick up on it. He definitely benefits from certain pairings. The itemization is still quite nice for him. The likes of Blackfire Torch, Liandry can enable really nice burn builds. I believe Ludens is still a viable option and Seraphs if you're looking for a bit more anti-burst. But yeah, he's in a solid spot at the moment. Definitely a good B tier option. You do want to put the games in though. That is definitely something which is kind of required out of him. Samira, still a very volatile B tier champion. Both Samira and Draven I put next to each other. They're very pilot-driven picks. If you can snowball, get an advantage, take over games, then you can really be rewarded on these champions, and they can be considered like S+ options if you are like really proficient on them. Obviously, if you struggle, you would just chain lose games. These picks need like they need to snowball. That is like the main kind of factor with them. And if you can't pilot them well enough to get that snowball going, then I would recommend just avoiding these picks and playing some other marksmen. Other marksmen being the likes of Sivir. Sivir is a very easy to play champion. Has really good wave clear. Can just sit back, scale, and then like really come online free for items into the game. There are different build variations, but I believe the static variation seems to be her best. Alongside that, you can run the likes of Flea, PTA. I've seen some first strike variations. It really comes down to what you need within that game. And yeah, she's a solid B tier option. Vayne probably deserves to be towards the low end of the B tier. I don't believe she's as bad as some people make her out to be. The pick definitely still has some power. She has quite good damage. If you are able to stay within range, she's quite nice into certain compositions where you can get a lot of value out of her kit. She does get outranged by a lot of marksmen, and she can definitely be punished early on into the game. Especially if you're paired with like a champion which can't really fight back or can't mitigate the amount you are being punished early on. Obviously, being someone who can be punished early does make her a bit more low elo skewed, but it's more pilot driven. If you can pilot Vayne well and you get value out of the picking her in the right spots, then you can definitely take over games and really snowball on this champion. For the moment, though, I'd recommend avoiding her in the ADC role. She works quite nicely as a top laner. Like, if you enjoy playing Vayne and you don't really mind which role you want to play her in, then yeah, play a top lane. But she's still a viable ADC by all means. Lucian, also actually going to be towards the low end of the B tier. Lucian has gained a lot of popularity. And Lucian just generalistically is a pretty popular champion. He does have really good synergies, obviously, pairings where you can really utilize his Light Slinger passive, or you get good support counter pick, which can also synergize with this champion. And he definitely has increasing value, but his damage doesn't, I mean, his damage is high, but sometimes not as high as some of the other marksman option. He's a bit shorter range. He plays more like a hybrid spellcaster with some of his kit's functionality, making sure you're landing the ultimate, the Qs, the Ws, being able to like synergize with your abilities. Obviously, he's still primarily an auto attacker, not anywhere near close to like Ezreal levels of spellcasting, but there is definitely that aspect. You can opt into like lucidity, stuff like that. And yeah, he's a solid B tier option. If you put the games in, once again, you'll be rewarded. As many of the picks on this tier list, if you put like if you become a one trick, then you will be rewarded. You'll climb the ranks. It just works a bit better with certain champions which have kits which are more tailored towards that sort of playstyle. Other picks in the B tier, we have Veigar, Ziggs, and Ezreal. So Veigar and Ziggs are my two B tier AP options. Both of them in relatively okay spots at the moment. Both of them can function quite nicely as APCs. Veigar tends to work a bit better in the mid lane. He has been pushed away from the bot lane role with some of the changes they made to him, making his AP ratios scale on his abilities with levels, which is obviously a more mid lane skewed thing. In Ziggs' case, he has a bit of range. You tend to utilize him as a counter pick, making sure you're synergizing with the correct pairings, and you can definitely get value out of this champion. He does see a level of competitive play. He is a solid B tier option. And then in Ezreal's case, he's a very hard to pilot pick. He's a very high skill ceiling. Like, if you want to watch someone play Ezreal, watch Dragdar. Dragdar is an incredibly good and talented Ezreal player. Definitely someone who you can learn a lot from. But obviously, he has a very high skill ceiling. If you put the games in, you'll be rewarded. If you don't, then he can feel quite hard to pilot in certain games. Your damage output will be a bit lower. You've really got to push this champion to its max to really feel like you can kind of 1v9 games oftentimes. Moving on to the A tier, we're going to start with MF. So MF is my recommended go-to easy champion. Like MF, very relatively simplistic here. It's kind of very cookie cutter on how you want to play this champion, making sure you're utilizing your passive, getting Q bounces off minions. Obviously, that becomes a lot harder the higher elo you go, as people are more aware of this champion's kit. Her ER, great synergistic abilities. If you're pairing her with an engage option, something like a rail, it can really feel quite oppressive playing this champion. And yeah, that's where a lot of her strength lies. Rushing BT, building a lot of AD, and just kind of running around, kind of using your kit to its best abilities. And yeah, she's really fast, good map mobility, good objective control. There's a lot of value on this champion. She's not quite S tier, but definitely a good easy to play A tier champion. If you're looking for a bit more util, then Ashe is something I'd recommend. Obviously, also a pretty easy to play pick. Her R has great setup potential. The lower you go, the less likely you're going to play against someone who's running cleanse. Obviously, it becomes a lot more standard these days. It used to be a lot more egregious, where like people in low elo just straight up wouldn't run cleanse. But yeah, nowadays it's more consistent, but yeah, still relatively easy to play champion, a good A tier option. Some of the other picks here, we have Nyla. Nyla tends to be a bit more synergistic reliant. Running her alongside things like Vataric can really get a lot of power out of this pick. She's in a better spot ever since they gave her a bit more durability, a bit more health regen, and yeah, she's a solid A tier champion. Kog'Maw, by no means is a bad pick. I've seen some people slander Kog'Maw as being like a bad option at the moment, but he's definitely viable. He has been, ever since they did the buffs like a while ago, he's really been benefiting from those. Lethal tempo being removed from the game was kind of like how Kog'Maw cope, but he's been fine since on PTA. Like, it's been a perfectly viable keystone option for him, combined with Bork being a bit better, and then like Bork into Ginsu's, Runan's, Terminus, stuff like that can all work quite nicely on him. He can opt into durability, which a lot of the other marksmen really can't, being Jack Show, obviously. And yeah, he's in perfectly good spot at the moment. Really good A tier pick. If you pair him with the likes of Braum, really oppressive laning phase, and yeah, very deserving of an A tier spot. Caitlyn probably sits towards the back end of the A tier, a bit more reliant on understanding how to make use of your range, combined with your sieging potential, and then like getting the combos down correctly. I mean, if you can work around, like if you can play around this and you nail it down, you're playing with like a duo who also understands the functionality of your champion. She can be really oppressive to play against, and you can definitely get a lot of value out of this pick. Obviously, it tends to be a bit more high elo elite skewed skill. This champion range just inherently is a higher elo skewed mechanic. Yeah, she's in a good spot at the moment if you nail all those, and yeah, sits within my A tier for the moment. Twitch tends to be a bit more gimmicky. We've actually seen some Twitch in competitive. I say some. I think we've seen one. It looked awful. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest. Twitch is a very solo queue balanced champion. Obviously, Invis just tends to naturally kind of skew that way, combined with the fact that he's a bit more bursty, with the likes of Bork, Runans, IE tending to be his free item core. Obviously, he still has good sustained teamfight damage if you're able to like open up from good angles with your ultimate. You can definitely find like angles where you can really like take over fights, but he's a bit more reliant on like snowballing and yeah, being able to power that advantage, finding those angles, and that's where a lot of his strength lies. Zeri is probably the best high elo marksman alongside Kaiser at the moment. Like, if you really want to play what is considered high elo meta, then both these champions in a really good spot at the moment. For the average player, they do drop down a bit. Both Kaiser and Zeri do sit within my A tier for the moment. Not because I like so much worse, they're just a bit harder to pilot, a bit more reliant on certain synergy. Well, not so reliant on certain synergies. That used to be the case with Zeri, but you can kind of play a bit more just generalistically, and you can definitely get a lot of value out of the champion. Kaiser, a bit more on her build variation, but as standard, you tend to go things like your static, your Ginsu's, your Nash's, and then like Zhonya Rabadon tends to be like your 5-item core, gives you a level of artillery capability, gives you some skirmishing power. There's definitely value to the build. sits in the A tier for the moment. Currently the most popular marksman in the game though, so you'll be lucky if you can like get to play the champion, as her ban rate is high, her pick rate is relatively high as well. The other 2 picks here, we have Karthus and Swain. I'm actually going to put them in the middle of the pack. I don't believe they deserve to sit at the top of the A tier, but both of them, in their own regards, are pretty strong champions. Karthus, obviously, for his global power, his very high damage output, can synergize quite nicely with certain pairings, works really well with the Leona at the moment. In Swain's case, he does tend to be a bit more low elo skewed, obviously reliant on people not really understanding his kit, staying within his ultimate, not really kiting it out correctly. That's where kind of like some of it, like most of Swain's power lies actually. His ult is like an incredibly powerful tool, can allow him to maintain fights and really just output a lot of damage, drain from that as well. Allows him to be a really good frontline option. But yeah, both of them very solid A tier AP options. Moving on to the S tier. Bar one. Smolder deserves to be in my B tier, so Smolder actually does move up. Smolder is in a substantially better spot with the 5 damage added onto his Q, as it allows him to CS easier, trade easier, stack easier. It's just all the things he really wanted. It's not, like, he was top end of the C tier, but now he sits like mid B tier. Definitely something I can recommend now as a good option. You're looking at like primarily like your Essence Reaver into Shojin builds, I believe, as being like a good strong item core, and then you're more of a mid-game marksman at this point. Does look to be where a lot of his power lies, alongside getting that execute, which then opens up like your next threshold, where he is also powerful, but doesn't really have the same level of range as a lot of the other marksmen, unless you're really stacking later on to the game, where you can get like huge AoE queues and definitely get a lot more value out of that ability. So the S tier consists of 4 champions. I'm going to start with the nerfed option, that is Brand. He now sits towards the back end of the S tier. Obviously, a lot of his power came from his synergy with Nami. It was doing a lot of heavy lifting for him. A lot of the other synergies just weren't anywhere near as strong with him. And honestly, if you're not pairing Brown with Nami, he probably sits more like A tier at the moment. But with Nami, like close to S plus option, but that is where a lot of his pairing is like that is the reason why a lot of people do pick him in the bot lane role. The nerfs did hurt his ability to do as much damage, but did have an impact. 1 second of E combined with 5 damage of E has definitely done a bit to shift the needle, but he's still pretty easy to play. He still has a lot of value in drafts. His damage output is very high, gives him great objective power, very powerful multi-role flex options still, so yeah, very deserving of an S tier spot. Seraphine has definitely been popping up a lot more recently. People have really caught on to the fact that Seraphine bot lane is once again good. It can opt into both like a hybrid AP utility option, where you can kind of utilize both aspects of Seraphine. Your damage isn't going to be as high as a lot of the other options here. In fact, she is one of the lower damage kits, but the amount of utility tools she has combined with shielding and healing just gives her so much merit within team comps. If you're not really confident in your own ability to carry games from a bot lane role, then Seraphine is something you can definitely opt into. If you're looking for easy to play champions, then yeah, Seraphine, Ashe, MF, Sivir are pretty hard champions to go wrong on, and yeah, both of them, all 4 of them can be really easy ways to quickly climb if you're not looking to OTP a champion. And then the other 2 picks here, we have Jinx and Jhin. So Jhin, obviously well known as being pretty solid at the moment, as just an all-round relatively high damage, not so much DPS marksman. He's not got the same hyper carry ability as a Jinx or a Zeri, but his damage is very high. His utility is really good. He synergizes with a lot of the common support pairings at the moment, which tend to be your engage options. He's not as good with enchanters. Like, you wouldn't want to pair Jhin with the likes of something like a Lulu or a Yumi. That would really struggle in lane. Does value things like Nami though, where you can really utilize the champion's ability to bully early on to the game. He has really good wave clear, and yeah, oftentimes that translates into a strong mid game, and then you can scale quite nicely if you're getting your items, and yeah, he's in a pretty powerful spot at the moment. A really good S tier pick. Not too difficult to play either though, but definitely has a level of a learning curve compared to some of the other champions here. In Jinx's case, she's still the go-to, relatively easy to play hyper carry option. She's not Exodia by any means, like she is sat next to a couple of solid options. I don't believe there is any ADC champion which really stands head and shoulders above at the moment. In fact, the ADC role is just generalistically a pretty balanced role at the moment. Obviously, in terms of like all roles, it's pretty strong. Obviously, we're seeing ADCs bleed quite frequently over into mid and top lane at the moment. The items are in a very good spot. With them being nerfed down, though, we will obviously see some people who will benefit from that. The likes of Kog'Maw definitely going to become stronger next patch. Really will benefit from some of the other champions losing a bit of power from that. But yeah, like I was saying, Jinx in a really good spot at the moment. Really good go-to hyper carry. Relatively easy to play. Pretty standard itemization. And yeah, those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.